So the climate crisis is well and surely upon us. We can see it, we can feel it, and we're breathing it. We've got to get off fossil fuels as fast as possible. And to do so, we've got to stick together, stay together, and keep it simple. Now, in 1845, Henry David Thoreau moved to the woods out here to live on his own and discover what life was really about. And even as he famously built his own shed and worked the land for his own food, fished and farmed and foraged, he was not really that far away from society. He would go into town and pick up a newspaper and put it down again. He would bum food and money off of the Emersons. And supposedly, his mother and sister would bring him those essential facts of life for a New Englander. I speak, of course, of donuts. Now, Henry was all about economy, how to make the work for life's essentials as efficient as possible. Simplify, simplify, right? For a man is rich in proportion to the number of things which he can afford to let alone. Now, there have been times in our history when we had no choice but to simplify. I'm sure that many of us had relatives, grandparents, great-grandparents who lived through the Depression or World War II, and who developed very strong habits of thrift, saving, even hoarding. My grandmother saved everything. We had to be very careful about unwrapping our Christmas presents because that paper had to be used the next year. And it was. So, and in World War II, of course, there was rationing and heavy social reinforcement to save for the war effort. It's amazing to look at Life magazine advertisements from that era, and you'll see these consumer companies telling you not to buy things, not to consume, to save rubber, metal, gasoline, even chocolate. So my parents were just barely old enough to remember the war. But they encountered their own era of scarcity with the oil crisis of the 1970s. And that's the environment in which I grew up. Energy efficiency was just expected. You turned out the lights. The house was cold in the winter. We all wore sweaters, right? We had tiny cars. We had a VW Bug and the big car, the Ford Fiesta. My father was an architect. And his specialty was home energy efficiency. He wrote a book about it, and he had a column. And for a while, he had a home energy audit business. He and his business partner, Rex, Dad's on the left, Rex is on the right, they called themselves the house doctors, hence the lab coats. And they would come to your house. This audit business was a totally new thing. They would come to your house with a blower door and a heat camera. And with the blower door, they would pressurize your house, and with the heat camera, they would see where the leaks were. And then they would recommend some kind of remedy, like insulation or air sealing or what have you. Well, it didn't last. The oil crisis passed, and people weren't so much into conservation, efficiency anymore, and Dad got out of the business. 30 years later, my wife and I bought our house, and I was stunned, appalled to discover that in 100 years of existence, no one had insulated the house. To me, this was like walking around naked. I just couldn't believe it. So our neighbors told us about this program called Mass Save. It's the efficiency program of the utilities, and they will give you an energy audit and then help you pay for insulation and other efficiency upgrades. So I called them up. The auditors drove up in the truck, got out of the truck, and I had not seen a blower door in 30 years. The techniques that Dad and Rex had pioneered 30 years before had since become standard operating procedure in recognizably the same form. I guess Dad was born too early. So this hit me different. It didn't just seem like this was about comfort or saving money anymore. It felt existential. It felt like time had passed that we didn't have to waste. The unfinished business of the 1970s of independence from fossil fuels has caught up with us. Back then, we were talking about energy efficiency and a nascent clean energy industry as the path to the future. And instead, we doubled down on fossil fuels and all of the environmental degradation that has followed, including our current climate crisis. It was a choice. So for us, we knew that the insulation was the first step on our decarbonization journey. We knew that we had to electrify everything to make use of increasing amounts of clean energy on the grid. And so that meant heat pumps for heating and cooling, and an induction stove when our old gas one went kaput. And to do all of this, we made use of certain state subsidies. And now the federal government has stepped in a big way with the Inflation Reduction Act with major subsidies for electrification. These programs have massive goals. Massachusetts has the goal of installing 1 million heat pumps by 2030. Imagine that, 1 million heat pumps, one household at a time. The money is great, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. In order for these programs to be successful, they have to be intelligible to the customers and the contractors and the communities that are going to implement it. Confusion and jargon and bewildering websites, they waste time that we don't have. In Massachusetts, all of these programs, these subsidies, are spread in a constellation of state programs, quasi-state programs, and it can be bewildering even for the contractors who are supposed to be experts at this stuff. So I would suggest that the state have a single point of contact for anyone to get in touch with. Your decarbonization coach, who can take you through from financing to installation to operation and then planning for your next step in decarbonization. There's a success story for this kind of thing, which comes from the great state of Maine. They made a big push for heat pumps to replace fuel oil. And they kept their program stupid simple. You get a postcard in the mail telling you you're eligible. They'll find you a contractor that will pick up the phone. The sign-up sheet is 1 sheet of paper, not 20, and the subsidy check arrives the next week. If you're buying your equipment at a big box store, you scan a QR code, you download your discount instantly. So the whole program is efficient with your time and your trust, and it's been incredibly successful. Since 2019, they've installed 82,000 heat pumps. That's saved 14.7 million gallons of oil per year, 328 million pounds of carbon dioxide. Now, the other thing that makes things go faster is neighborly advice. And in many communities across Massachusetts, heat pump coaching has become a thing. In my hometown, we have a program called Electrify Arlington, where neighbors advise neighbors about the complexities of decarbonization, what questions to ask a contractor, how to size your system, how to operate the system, and of course, how to find the subsidies. So we're building communal knowledge around this topic. Now, not everybody is in a situation where they can take cash on hand and leverage these subsidies. There's a huge racial wealth gap which applies to energy efficiency. This is the legacy of redlining, which deprived people of the ability to invest in their own homes. And so that discrimination leads to a situation where people pay higher bills, they have the most exposure to climate extremes, and to deadly air pollution. They're dealing with very complex challenges with landlords, with retrofitting older houses. These folks need advocacy and simplification more than anyone. So we all live in an era of scarcity. Scarcity of time and attention. We're asking ordinary people to implement this historic transition. And we don't have 30 years to implement it. We have maybe 7 years to completely mainstream this stuff. So my ask is this. For policymakers, keep in mind the cognitive and the social aspects of decarbonization. And for the rest of us, let's look out for each other. Let's share knowledge. Let's create a culture of decarbonization. It's too late for any of us to feel like we're early adopters, going off and building our own sheds in the woods. This has to feel more like a barn raising. So let's all show up for each other, and by all means, bring donuts. Thank you.